Central Africans, Atlantic Creoles, and the Foundation of the Americas, 1585 to 1660. This book is by Haywood and Thornton, and I may have done a review on this book already. I know I did several written reviews of it. This book is significant as to where this is the last book that I did for my master's degree in history. And I received a lot of pushback from my professors pursuant to my view of the book. And I think that I am developed enough in my training to understand opinion versus misunderstanding. I will give it to the professors in their argument with me that the book had more value than I gave it initially. I just think that the issues in the book were so blaring that the issues overrode the value, especially on first read. But let's start off with the arguments that they were making. First, they were talking about Creolization. Creolization is what occurred in Central Africa, where the Portuguese had penetrated the African continent, where a lot of Europeans weren't able to, and were allowed to have certain settlements there, which of course they brought Christianity with them. And Haywood and Thornton are presenting that there was a Europeanized culture, which they're saying is not. Well, there's an argument that it's not Europeanized, but they're saying that a new culture developed that was a mixture of African ancestry and Portuguese ancestry. And the proof of this is the naming rights, foods, clothing, customs, where you could see African and Portuguese coming together to form a new and different culture independent of either. Now, they did admit that a lot of the Christianity was imposed by military action from the Portuguese to the Africans. And I felt that more so Creolization, in their Creolization discussion, it was more about the Creole people being Europeanized than something new actually forming. Because every bit of proof was how Africans became more like the Portuguese. That's what the focus was. And because of that, one of their arguments was that the forced conversion to European values that has traditionally been thought of when we discuss chattel slavery in North America is not necessarily accurate, because the first slaves, unlike we thought, generally taught, that are taken from were taken from the west coast of Africa, they weren't. They were taken from Central Africa, where they already had this Europeanization through Creolization. So they're saying, and they have documentation, that the first slaves actually came from Central Africa. Hence, there was no reason to have this forced Europeanization in North America because they were already Europeanized to an extent. So the first valuable lesson of this book is that the first slaves were not taken from Western Africa. They were taken from Central Africa. And these were people who had an understanding and interaction and understood the language of the people that were enslaving them. Great information to know. Another valuable part of this book was they talked about slavery beyond the Western Hemisphere. It gave a degree of value to the politics and things that were going on in Africa before it gave a backdrop to the activity before it came to the Western Hemisphere, the Caribbean, South America, North America. Their third argument was that there were two generations of slaves that were brought here. Now, the Creoles that were brought here that were already familiar with the Europeans and had spoken some European dialects, they set the first culture of slavery in America. Now, this was before the plantation era. So they break slavery into two different eras. They break it into first generation slavery or Creole slavery, and then plantation slavery. The plantation slavery, obviously, was the beginning of chattel slavery in the middle of the 17th century, when they did actually start taking people from the western coast of Africa, where it was more labor intensive as opposed to service intensive. And service intensive doesn't mean bring me tea. Service intensive means there was a possibility that you were more of an indentured servant. You had a greater likelihood of earning money. You had a greater likelihood of buying your freedom. You had a greater likelihood of manumission because the focus was on the service less than the labor. When the plantation economy hit, the focus was on the labor and only the labor, indefinitely. There was zero agency in the slaves as opposed to the Creole slaves, where it was not as much indefinite focus. When plantation slavery started, not only did the slaves lose their agency, but their children were born with no agency. That was not necessarily the case in Creole slavery, where slavery was imposed on a person, not a people. That's the difference between Creolization and plantation slavery. So those were the three major points. Creolization occurred in Central Africa, and how it occurred. That Creole experience or European experience transferred to the United States through the Creole culture, which set the first slave environment or community, not the imposition of the proverbial roots indoctrination of European values through force. And the third point was the two generations, so to speak, of slaves in America. The Creole generation and then the plantation generation. Now, what I felt about this book, I didn't enjoy it. The defense that was given to me was what I thought was wrong because the lady that wrote the book was black. I think especially for well-respected, studied, published historians, that's a very weak argument. To say that someone could not have meant what they said because they were black. I felt that the book was, I thought it was in poor taste. I see the value in it. I see the value in what I said. I saw value in the fact that there was Creolization occurred in Central Africa, that the first slaves came from Central Africa, and that there were two different generations of slaves that were brought over here that had two different experiences. The Creoles, per Haywood and Thornton, had a higher degree of freedom and manumission, whereas the plantation slaves didn't, which were more of the Western African experienced people. And they said they felt that that was because of their familiarity with the Europeans. I think that was probably more economic. They used the word easy, that it was easier for the African to communicate with the European, that it was easier for them to get their freedom. It was easier for them to get manumissions. And I just thought, that's a poor choice of words. And I should not reflect what I think you mean as opposed to reading what you said. Because when I was talking to one of the professors that I was defending against, they were telling me, well, obviously they didn't mean it was easy. So, well, that's what they said. So it kind of says, to me, what they communicated was, well, it wasn't all the Europeans forcing European culture on the Africans. They brought that over here with them. I thought that was a purpose of it. I just don't think, and I'm not extremely well read in the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust, but I think that would be met with some resistance if a book were written that said, well, the first people that were sent to the camps, they had it easier than the second group that was sent to the camps. It was a hard experience for everybody, and I think in finding out this great information, they went too far with their conclusion. The great information being the Creolization, and the first slaves actually came from Central Africa, and that it is great likelihood that a lot of the European culture transferred over with the Creole people. But I think a lot of holes fell after that. Does that diminish what happened to the Western Africans? Can we actually say that the manumissions were actually culturally based as opposed to economically based? I would recommend that the book be read just to explore those issues and see what you think. Again, Central Africans, Atlantic Creoles, and the Foundation of the Americas, 1585 to 1660.